Okay, my time preservation meeting is thrilled to welcome you to the 47th annual Art Deco meeting. Thank you. We are celebrating Florida's coastal communities, historic coastal communities, which ironically are now in peril. My name is Nina Whitworth, and I'm vice chair of the board. We are thankful that you're here. And for those of you not members, we invite you to please join on our website at mvpl.org. Members receive free walking tours, a gift shop discount, and our online e-newsletter. More importantly, your donations and membership support our ongoing efforts to preserve, promote, and protect historic architecture on Miami Beach and beyond. Historic preservation, as I said, is now in peril in the state of Florida, now dubbed the Tallahassee Takeover, which is going to negate local jurisdiction, and it will be override, and it will also override our national historic designation and open us up to development on Ocean Drive. We are working diligently to ensure our preservation mission will be sustained for the long term. And now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Victor Dupuy, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Miami School of Architecture. His research focuses on the early modern Spanish and Ibero-American world, with 20th century Cuba and contemporary architecture. His books include Architectural Temperance, Spain and Rome, 1700 to 1759, Transformations in Classical Architecture, New Directions in Research and Practice, Emilio Sanchez in New York and Latin America, on Cuban modernism, mid-century architecture, 1940 to 1970, with our own Jean-François Lejeune. Dr. Dupuy was the president of the CIFTIS Foundation from 2016 to 2018, and is currently the president of DACAMOMA U.S. Florida chapter.
Thank you, Nina. So I have a confession to make. I'm a bad person.
Wanna lie down?
I don't need to lie down. As an architectural historian, I have, for decades, used architectural photography, largely as a vehicle to discuss buildings, landscapes, monuments, works of art, the artists, but never, ever do I ever talk about the people behind the lens. And I think most architectural historians are also guilty of that. And it was while writing the book Cuban Modernism with my colleague Jean-François here that we inadvertently came across a husband and wife photographic team of Annette and Rudi Rada, who were working in Cuba. And I found their work to be so stimulating that as I was finishing that book, I asked myself, I wonder what more there is of their work. And I discovered at the History Miami Museum some 2,000 works of theirs. Almost their entire collection was donated after they died to History Miami, and then there's a few other collections like Vizcaya and elsewhere. And I started a new project, which I'm more than halfway through, and it will include a book manuscript on the life of these photographers, as well as an exhibition at History Miami in May of 2025. And so this presentation today is a kind of an offshoot of that research, because any book you write, there's so much residual material that ends up opening new avenues. So I apologize on behalf of all architectural historians for ignoring the figures behind the lens. Okay. Miami and Miami Beach in the 1920s and 1930s were cities on the precipice. as noted by Mary N. Woods in her book, Beyond the Architect's Eye, Photographs in the American Built Environment, the two cities, precariously poised between past and present, boom and bust, creation and destruction. Close quotes. The architectural photography of the time, as shown in the work of someone like John Newton Chamberlain, captured views of homes, businesses, streetscapes, agricultural products, natural scenes. And he was one of the pioneer photographers here in Miami. There's an image in the room next door as well of his. And he was known also as the postcard king, producing many of these postcards. Photographers like Gleason Waite Romer, Marion Post Wolcott, and Max Waldman, the latter two being from New York, were leading the way in capturing the changing cities, buildings, and landscapes of the region in the 1930s and 40s, and the paradox of the magic city as both a fantasy and a reality, which we'll explore further on as I go. Gleason Waite Romer stood out as a formidable figure in South Florida, having arrived to Miami in 1925. He worked briefly for a newspaper before becoming a freelance photographer. And throughout his life, he recorded all aspects of the region well into the 1950s until his death in 1971. And Romer traveled throughout South Florida, taking pictures from airplanes, boats, anywhere he could take a picture of the growing city and its hinterland. And again, these are themes that I will continue to cover over the course of the lecture. His images of the Mediterranean revival architecture were coupled with his views of Havana, which he took in 1926, several years prior to Walker Evans' historic journey to the Cuban capital. There, Romer captured both the magnificence of the city's monumental buildings and the harsh reality of urban life in a country where black and white rarely ever met. The point was also captured by Evans in his photography to accompany Carlton Beale's book, The Crime of Cuba, from 1933. Beals was an investigative journalist and pointed out that Cuba was, in his two countries, black Cuba and white Cuba, hinting that for the average Cuban, especially the well-off, there never existed a, quote, Negro problem, close quote. Marion Post Wolcott came to South Florida as a government employee to explore migrants, urban life, and the distinction between the well-off and the poor, even though the region had bounced back from the Great Depression before other areas of the country. As a social realist, her photographs were not primarily focused on self-expression or exploration, but rather documentation, however sad or beautiful they may have been. In that sense, the two faces of South Florida appear in her work. During the winter months, when the wealthy snowbirds descended on Miami and Miami Beach, the area, like today, well, now it's always all the time, was transformed into a modern resort for northern and midwestern tourists. Even small towns along Lake Okeechobee and as far north as Monticello, which is near Tallahassee, boo, all benefited from the emerging Florida tourist industry. The real city of Miami was not exactly what the brochures and travelers reported. Racial tensions were real. And Max Waldman, a New York photographer and member of the Civilian Conservation Corps, a voluntary government work relief program for unemployed men, came to South Florida in 1947 as a seasonal worker to photograph Miami's Overtown neighborhood. His 52 black and white images were a profound exploration/survey of the, quote, Harlem of the South, though not all of his images were as glamorous as the neighborhood's moniker suggests. But my talk today is not on this prolific and terribly important period of South Florida photography. Instead, I will be focusing on the post-war era, where photographers such as Ezra Stoller in New York, Julius Shulman in Southern California, and George E. Kidder Smith in Europe and throughout the Americas began working closely with mid-century architects, capturing the clean lines of modern buildings, presenting them as progressive forms for ideal living, enhanced by compelling landscapes and climates. In 1990, the Miami-Dade Public Library engaged in a project called Miami Thriving Change, 1940 to 1990, which was a series of exhibitions documenting the arts, publishing, and business in Greater Miami. An entire exhibition was dedicated to 50 years of photography, with over 50 artists selected for representation. My talk today will expand on this briefly, split more and less, I should note, selecting a handful of artists at exhibition and several who did not participate, but all of them contributed significantly to the changing face of architectural photography in South Florida in the post-war era. Samuel Gottscho was a New York architectural, landscape, and nature photographer whose work coincides with that of the three pre-war photographers I mentioned just previously. I first came across his work while researching for my book on the Cuban-American visual artist Emilio Sanchez, whose paternal uncle built a house in Miami Beach by the famous Miami architects Robert Law Weed and Edwin T. Reeder, which Gottscho thoroughly documented. They're all at the Library of Congress if you want to follow them up. His post-war photography, as we shall see, played an important role in promoting the mid-century architecture of Miami and Miami Beach. So he was one of these figures that worked both sides of the war, before and after. Ezra Stoller, another New York architectural photographer, really needs no introduction, other than to mention his work in Miami is hugely understudied. And his role in promoting the mid-century architecture of the region, again, as we shall see, is far greater than has previously been considered. His most famous images are in Miami, are really things like the Robert Law Weed parking garage, which sadly no longer exists, which was published in Time magazine. We'll see other works of his. I'm just going through a list of a handful of people that we'll be looking at in greater depth as an introduction, really. Klara Farkas really should not be considered an architectural photographer in the commercial or professional sense, though her work did touch on architectural topics. As a portraitist and ethnographer, her work was much more focused on people and their significant contributions more than anything else. Born in Budapest, she arrived in Miami with her family in 1940 after fleeing to London in 1937. She discovered photography as a complement to her husband George Farkas's work in interior design and architecture. And again, we'll see this momentarily. Though the Library of Congress also has a great collection of her studies of Ethiopian Christian churches, really worth seeing. Her exhibition of 10 Women of Coconut Grove included portraits of such well-known people as Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and Marion Manley, two women whose efforts in preservation and design we'll again see in my presentation today. Finally, I will be considering the architectural photography of Annette and Rudi Rada that I had mentioned earlier, who captured the new awareness of mass tourism, bringing to light the changing identities of several Caribbean nations and their people. At the same time, their photography documented post-war progress in the built environment to the detriment of indigenous and impoverished cultures who were largely unprepared for the onslaught of modernity. Though they worked together, Rudi tended to photograph modern architecture and people in an architectural environment, whereas Annette adopted a more ethnographic approach, photographing people and cultures with their customs, habits, and mutual differences. The central image is a composite image, a fusion of two photographs that were produced for one of their several exhibitions. We don't know which one it was. The top image by Annette is of a Latania palm tree, whereas the lower image by Rudi is of the 550 building in downtown Miami by the architecture firm of Robert Law Weed and Associates. And the photos were combined to illustrate the similarity, and this is on the back of this image. The photos were combined to illustrate the similarity of man-made and natural structures, but also it captures the mutual compatibility of the two. As we'll see, as I'm about to show, how do I get this mouse off? There we go. Print media played an important role in propelling a positive new view of Miami modernism, with several state and local journals drawing attention to the quickly developing post-war region. From left to right, Florida Architect was the official journal of the Florida Association of Architects of the American Institute of Architects. For many years in the 1950s, Igor Polovitsky was its president, and the journal's editorial team consisted of people like Edwin T. Reeder, among others. It was an early proponent of architectural photography, though its intended purpose was to serve the profession more than anything else. Florida Architecture in the center, on the other hand, served both purposes brilliantly. Based out of Lincoln Road, the journal advertised itself as a pictorial publication of Florida architecture, interior and industrial design, interior decorating, sculpture, and other allied work. Its editorial board consisted of Robert Law Weed, Wal Snyder, Robert M. Little, Russell T. Pancoast, Robert Browning Parker, Robert Fitch Smith, and many others. Because it was largely based in Miami, it had a decidedly South Florida bias. Its art director was a man named Jan Hankowski, who also worked for the Miami Herald and whose offices were based at 135 Southeast 3rd Street. Hankowski was responsible for the selection of photographers, and perhaps more than anyone in the South Florida at the time, gave opportunities to emerging architectural photographers like Annette and Rudi Rada. Design Plus was a new quarterly architectural journal published by Arts and Design Incorporated, the DuPont Building in Miami. It was created by Henry Wright, its chairman, the former managing editor of the Architectural Forum from 1942 to 49, and Ezra Stoller was its vice president, with an advisory board that included George Farkas, Robert M. Little, Rufus Nims, Alfred Browning Parker, Igor Polovitsky, Paul Rudolph Wolsnyder, Robert Law Weed, among others. Though short-lived, as far as I know, there were only 2 editions, and I found them at the University of Michigan Library. You can get it through the interlibrary loan. They had 2 editions in 1950. The journal stood out from other arts and design journals of the day insofar as it sought out projects of quality rather than timing. Instead of trying to be the first to show such and such a project, editors sought to provide a more rounded, more complete, more understandable presentation of the designs they showcase. It's really a brilliant magazine if you ever get a hand on it. Of course, popular journals, lifestyle magazines, and what was called at the time the homemaker press were, of course, much more opportune venues for architectural photographers than the professional press. They reached broader audiences and touched on a greater variety of artistic disciplines. The house and garden. How can you top that, right? Igor Polovitsky was among the leading figures of the tropical modern movement, producing a variety of cleverly designed birdcage houses, hotels, office buildings, etc. And his 1949 Heller House on Biscayne Island was photographed by both Ezra Stoller and the Radas. The image on the upper left is an intimate portrait of Annette taken by Rudi. They would often do that. They would photograph each other, and it's a lovely story. Anyway, the Heller House turned the traditional relationship between house and porch inside out, with the house inserted into a box-like tent. And it was prominently featured on the cover of Florida Architecture, there you see it, in 1950, and House and Garden in 1952, noting how the landscaping also captured the natural flora of the region, reducing the amount of lawn and gravel typically associated with conventional suburban residences. Kenneth Trister, who is an architect and artist still alive today, was another leading figure of this movement, and his houses were regularly featured in newspaper articles and journals such as Architectural Record. Here, the Burton Cohen House overlooking Biscayne Bay in North Miami was designed with an open plan with several courtyards, where am I? Lost my place, and outdoor spaces, built of wood with stone flooring, recalling the early timber structure of the region. And Rudi Rada photographed this for the journal Architectural Record. I mentioned newspapers. The central image is another Kenneth Trister house. And these are all by the Radas. They regularly worked for the Sunday Home section throughout the 1950s in the Miami Herald. But they also worked for the New York Times, Look magazine, where there are images of Havana. This is taken from the top bar at the Havana Hilton, now the Havana Libre Hotel, was featured in many. This was also featured in the Miami Herald as well. One of the key components to promoting modern contemporary design in South Florida was that complementing it with historic preservation only increased the public's desire to visit the region. For instance, the Radas travel brochure for Coral Gables, I think that's on the far right, presented the Garden City as a modern resort unto itself, with elegant buildings like the Mediterranean-inspired Biltmore Hotel by Schultz and Weaver, the Venetian Pool and City Hall, both by Phineas Paste, a modern high school and a modern university, which we'll see, and of course, a modern comfortable homes, making it the cultural and educational center of South Florida. The historic 1830 home of Captain John H. Geiger in Key West, known as the Audubon House, where the French-American artist, naturalist, and ornithologist produced his celebrated elephant folio, was slated for demolition in 1958. But a grant from the Mitchell-Wolfson Family Foundation saved the historic landmark, and the Rada's brochure of the house and its contents emphasized, it's 1830, and you are there. Finally, the Villa Vizcaya, we all know everything about it, right? After the death of James Deering, had fallen into disrepair. And Miami-Dade County acquired the property in 1952 and began its restoration and transformation into the Dade County Art Museum. The Rada's many photographs of the estate not only captured the whimsical splendor of the Italian palace and tropical gardens, but had them included in the article Fabulous Vizcaya in the home section of the Chicago Sunday Tribune in November 1956, reminding its readers that the breezy villa also owes a great deal to the windy city. Deering, of course, is from Chicago. The Radas also produced a promotional flyer for the museum and gardens, as well as several postcards of the estate. Civic, commercial, and institutional entities, not to mention the associated landscapes and public realm that accompanied them, also played an important role in promoting architectural photography. The University of Miami in Coral Gables was originally founded in 1926. We all know the story by George Merritt, where the Spanish were allowed to build on Charlton and Phineas Paste. But due to the hurricane and the Great Depression, the university's building campaign floundered, and so the Postwar era, when its first president, Bowman Foster Ash, took advantage of the U.S. government's new educational programs to launch, on the 20th anniversary of the university's founding, a bold vision of a new modern campus. Ash hired Dorothea and Marion Post, who was released so earlier by Klara Farkas, to provide the university with a new master plan on the original site. But now the mission was driving departure for the 26th time. And it's important to remember that flexible functionalist approach to campus planning had never really been tested in the university settings other than at Florida Southern College by Frank Wright in 1938, and at Illinois Institute of Technology by Louis Vannevar in 1941, both of which were photographed by Ezra Stoller in the late 1940s. So it comes as no surprise that Stoller was also commissioned to photograph the new modern buildings at the University of Miami campus. And here we see on the left the classroom building, and above, down the right on the center, the student community building, the student recreation center. All of these were photographed by Stoller for Florida Architecture magazine. While Stoller photographed the exterior, Jan Hankowski was able to photograph the interior of that building, focusing on the dining hall on the upper left, the courtyard. But what I really want to focus on is the lounge, the student lounge, which you see on the right. The reason is Klara Farkas also photographed that space. You can see the two images on the left. In particular, because the interior design was done by her husband, George Farkas, whose image you can see on the upper center, and many of his textile designs that were used. I don't have a pointer, but it's pleasant. But the right here, these chairs in the back all contained the textile pattern you see on the upper right. And this space was so popular that even the Radas were given a chance to photograph it. The image on the left of the staircase was included in an advertisement for the Dade Marble and Tile Company that was shown in the first edition of Design Plus magazine with the caption, "Superb example of permanent, everlasting terrazzo." That stair, you can just see it here on the upper left, you can just see the railing coming down. You can just see it. What a loss. What a loss. So much of what I'm showing, by the way, no longer exists, as you know. But what a loss. What a great space. And of course, they photographed a student reading, a very elegant. I mean, gosh, if students dress like that today, they should return to dress code. I mean, my gosh. I would have to dress up to teach students like that. No, I dress down because my students dress down. My goodness. Other important buildings, that were photographed were the Merrick Memorial Building by Robert M. Little, by Jan Hankowski for Florida Architecture, and the Law Building that was photographed by another New York photographer, Alexander George, who was a staff member at the Museum of Modern Art, and he regularly exhibited with Ansel Adams and others. And he also produced a very interesting book on the temples of Kyoto. His photography was used for this book, The Temples of Kyoto. But again, another New York architect being brought. So, I mean, you have to realize that the University of Miami was not just having great buildings designed, but they were having some of the most important architectural photographers locally and from around the country come to document these buildings and publish them in major journals. I can keep going. The Radas photographed the Jerry Herman Ring Theater. By the way, actually, we're not supposed to call it the Ring Theater. The Herman family is so upset by this. 70 years of people calling it the Ring when they want to call it. So the university is now making an effort to call it the Herman Theater. But I think we're all going to continue calling it the Ring. What can you do? This was published in Progressive Architecture, though it was incorrectly attributed to the Southern California photographer Julius Shulman, who was not on campus photographing these buildings. These images are at the History Miami Museum, and they're stamped on the back, Rada Photography. Sadly, that's the case. And of course, I think the last university building I'll show you is the Joe and Emily Lowe Art Museum. I neglected to mention earlier that a Klara Farkas image of Robert Motherwell at the Lowe Gallery, that's not the Miami Lowe Gallery, that's Hofstra University. Emily Lowe, because you can tell by the windows, and it's not the Lowe here. It's a different Lowe. Anyway, the Lowe here, as you can see, has no windows. The Radas photographed the opening dedication exhibition of its permanent collection, as well as an opening exhibition on the University of Miami architecture, which featured many of the new buildings and furniture and interiors. So many of those images I've been showing you are lined along there, and furniture by Farkas, etc., were included. Civic buildings such as the both modern and historic ones, right? So the Dade County Auditorium in Little Havana by Stewart and Skinner was photographed by the Radas, and I'm particularly fond of this image with the peekaboo window, which is at the landing of the staircase that takes you up to the upper mezzanine. And both Hankowski and the Radas photographed the Miami Memorial Library that was in Bayfront Park, also by Stewart and Skinner, regrettably torn down. A kind of the closest thing Miami ever had to a Greek temple sitting in a landscape. It's really a stunning building, gone. I believe 85, 86? I don't know the exact date, but it was in the 80s. A great loss.
That they knocked it down.
Yeah. And then, of course, they also photographed. They would not photograph exclusively Miami modern buildings. They would happily photograph things like the former what are my notes? Miami Daily News. Let's call it what it is. The Freedom Tower. The post-war period in South Florida experienced a surge in population growth and new construction, with several regionalist responses to the international style flourishing in tandem. The region became an escape from post-World War II Middle America, shaped largely by the desire for leisure and entertainment. As noted by my colleague Alan Schulman, Miami became a laboratory to explore new urban patterns, new building types, evolving aesthetics, and emerging environmental consciousness. Miami Modern is often associated with the resort architecture of Miami Beach, so the style resonated in the vernacular context of residential architecture throughout the region. And of course, Florida architecture was leading the way in promoting the various trends. You can see a much more international style box on stilts, you could say, on the left by Rufus Nims. A much more organic architecture by the Zimmerman. I believe they were father-son, not twins, father-son in Sarasota, and then a kind of hybrid in between vernacular wood structure with this kind of modern space age A-frame by Parker Browning in the middle. Again, color was featured on the covers of these magazines. And, you know, everybody was involved in them. Stoller was not just photographing the famous work, people like Paul Rudolph and Alfred Parker Browning, but lesser-known works like the Jorge B. Sanchez residence by Robert Law Weed and Associates. I'd mentioned earlier that Emilio Sanchez had a paternal uncle who had a house designed by Robert Law Weed. This is the brother of that paternal uncle. So another paternal uncle had this house in Miami Beach, also designed by Robert Law Weed and documented by Ezra Stoller. Alexander George, that I mentioned previously, photographed one of the most important houses by Rufus Nims and Robert Brown, the Miller residence, which was not quite an umbrella house, but it was a hybrid. It was a kind of a maison domino, if you all know what that is, Le Corbusier, basically a kind of box on stilts, open, with a cage, attached cage at the back for the swimming pool. Finally, in terms of the houses, the Radas worked with many of the architects, including Edwin T. Reeder, for the Samuel Friedman House, also known as the Louver House on the upper left, the Zelda Kaplan House by William Kittle, also photographed by Ezra Stoller, with its super elegant George Nelson slat bench in the foreground. And then houses by William Vaughn, the Conas House in Fort Lauderdale, a kind of residence that I can never, ever imagine getting built today. I mean, its location it's kind of incredible that they were able to do that. And then the house of Robert M. Little himself, a wonderful courtyard house hidden behind this porte cochere screen that you see with a courtyard behind it and the house wrapping around it. The new hotels on Miami Beach, of course, were the most conspicuous examples of how modern architecture was transforming the region. And the decade after the war, between 46 and 56, witnessed 55 new hotels built in Miami, giving it the title of the Capital of Vacationland. And the number of yearly tourists in Miami Beach jumped from 50,000 in 1935 to an estimated 2 million in 1955. Remember Walter Gottscho that I mentioned earlier was very active in promoting work of the hotels. But with catchy names like the Albion, meaning white land in Latin, which was a reference to the White Cliffs of Britain, the Fontainebleau and Sanssouci, these buildings resemble the sleek and trendy ocean liners and automobiles that enabled mass tourism to thrive. The stylish contemporary furniture inside displayed its agency in expressing an international and apolitical modern language, even though they were persuasive elements in promoting the changing tastes of those fortunate enough to benefit from the fantasy of tourism and travel. Again, as quoting Alan Schulman, the 500-room Fontainebleau Hotel from 1954, Morris, and I'm going to throw something out, Morris Lapidus. My friend Arthur Dunkelman, who runs the Black Center of Miami, insists correct Central European pronunciation is that Lapidus. Lapidus is incorrect. Well, yes, my name should be Dope B. So anyway. All right, Morris Lapidus. Where am I? His first solo hotel project in Miami Beach synthesized the incremental moves of his earlier collaborative projects using colossal scale, sculpted massing, and uncaged cultural theming based on playful historical illusion. As a self-contained microcosm of a full resort city set on a sprawling site, the Fontainebleau achieved unprecedented freedom of form. I draw attention to the image on the upper right with the grand circular staircase to nowhere that spiraled from the lobby. It wasn't nowhere. There was a coat check in the mezzanine, which allowed the vein, should we say the vein, to ascend and descend for everyone to see without the cap. And to do so with this incredible reproduction of Piranesi's view of the Roman Forum, an image that has been sadly replaced by miniature gold mosaic tile. Bring back the Piranesi, I say. It's appropriate with the gardens. Even more sad to me is the statue C at 3101 Collins Avenue, originally designed in 1947 by the Chicago architect Roy France and completed by Morris Lapidus, who was in New York at the time, working mostly on idiosyncratic and highly photogenic interiors. The hotel opened in 49, and it was published in so many magazines, Design Plus, Florida Architecture, and just look at this glam, Baroque modernism. If you see, it's now called the Riva. It's I think a Spanish company. Rio, something like that. The Rio. They've stripped of everything. The pool's gone. The zigzag pool by Lapis is gone. The wraparound metal is gone. Anyway. In addition to the glamorous hotels on Miami Beach and other coastal areas, South Florida also sought to appeal to the average working class American by offering more economical vacation options, which in this case, the Radas also photographed. The Key Colony Motel, built in 1951, consisting of a series of modern vernacular cottages designed by the architect Robert Fitch Smith, with interiors by the Coconut Grove designer James Merrick Smith, no relation. The motel offered the perfect modern bungalow for traveling families seeking a waterfront destination, open, walkable landscapes, and wooden decks for casual lounging overlooking the beautiful beaches and natural of Key Biscayne. The central images are the tour that was produced, and the images on the left were included in exhibitions that this project was exhibited in New York at the Architecture Center. Personal note, as a child, every summer we would come to Miami, and we would stay there. In the late 60s and early 1970s, we would stay there. And some of my earliest memories of Miami are playing in the park between the bungalows, and then there were also a sort of motel strip, and it's been replaced by a rather large. But I say that because so much of this project has become personal to me that I had no idea that so many of these things were kind of part of my DNA, and it just.
Where about that?
Where? It's where the Key Colony Hotel or villas and the huge. It's the very first project as you enter left. Huh? It's not this stuff. Boom. Now it's just the big stuff. That big. Yeah. Rufus Nimitz started working with Howard Johnson's in the late 1940s to develop a typical model for the company, resulting in a chain of motels stretched up and down the East Coast, using continuous plate glass walls, projecting prairie-style orange roofs. Nim's designs simulated the residential character of garden apartments, and the Radas also photographed that. And on the way down to Miami to stay at the Key Colony Motel, we would stay at various Howard Johnsons.
Perfect.
This is a lesser-known project in Tampa, the Anheuser-Busch Brewery and Busch Gardens entry pavilion by the St. Petersburg architect William B. Harvard. And the Rada photographed this for the Miami Herald. You can see on the upper right, little memorial on the lower right, which, if you haven't figured it out, it's a giant A related to the Anheuser family, right? And that's it was originally the memorial honoring the family, and that was designed by the landscape architect Charles Wedding. I also love this entry pavilion. It's this wonderful portico. Got to rebuild that somewhere. I mean, it's just really a fabulous design. So I mentioned Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. We know that in the late 1940s, the Everglades became a national wildlife refuge, and the Radas very quickly started photographing the canals, the agriculture. This is a picture of Annette again. There's Annette again by Rudi, showcasing the actual the fact that it's a national the U.S. Department of Interior. That's what I was looking for. And there used to be cattle in the Everglades and in the pines. This lower left, you can see very briefly what kind of these are invasive species of flowers that grow on the water, and they're very, very, I forget what they're called. But again, you could see an invasive species. They write about this on the back of it. This invasive species of water, of a flower that is consuming the stream and creating devastating for the natural the flora and the fauna of the region, really. Without going too far into the Hispanic Caribbean, just like Walter Gottscho, the Radas would travel to Havana and Puerto Rico, among other places, and there was a seamless connection between Miami and Havana. Cheap flights, cheap steamers. P&O would, for like $48, you can do an overnight from Miami to Havana. And of course, Polovitsky designed the Riviera Hotel for Meyer Lansky, and the Radas produced the brochure, as well as many of the images that Jean-Francois and I use in our book, Human Modernism. Puerto Rico was, through their Operation Bootstrap in the 1940s, was aimed at promoting tourism through new hotels and cultural festivities, such as the Pablo Casals, who retired in mid-1955 to San Juan. He had married after his first wife died, he married a very young Puerto Rican woman, and he created a musical festival in 1957, which was a big hit at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras Theater. And again, the Radas were commissioned to come and document the opening ceremony. Casals became very sick and couldn't perform at that festival, sadly. It's all in my book. So, as my title suggests, the paradox of pleasure is, well, you know the old saying, if you want to be happy, forget about it, right? Because the more you seek happiness, the less you find it, right? Right? The harder you try to pursue, it's like if drinking wine. Ooh, this is good. I'm going to have another. I'm going to have another. And eventually it goes downhill, right? You can't sustain it, right? So the paradox of pleasure is peril, right? The paradox of all new tourism, of course, was that the natural landscape that drew people to the region in the first place was transformed into a commercially conceived vision of an ideal landscape, a utopian paradise with a comprehensive faith in technology, construction, and what John Dos Passos described so clearly in his 1936 book, The Big Money, as the dark side that underlined the pursuit of the American dream. During the early 1900s, several building supply companies operated in Miami, Florida, supporting the city's growth and development. Alfred Destin was the head of such a company that carried his name. He also came from a small town in the Panhandle of Florida, that was named after his family. in 1920, he moved to Miami and established a company that would supply cement products for the building industry in South Florida for several generations. And of course, they're just digging up the Everglades. And so here's one of those ads for the Sanssouci from Progressive Architecture, right? And to facilitate all of that, automobiles were necessary, right? Affordable automobiles combined with the development of extensive highway infrastructure encouraged suburbanization. And we get things like Biscayne Boulevard perceived as this dynamic, driving place. I think this is great. I think we should have car dealerships hug the street, actually, not set back in parking lots. And of course, things like city stations, which were all part of this promotion of travel and getting to South Florida. It became apparent that the success of Florida as a tourist destination depended largely on roadways that connected the state with the rest of the country. S.A. Belcher Sr. arrived in South Florida by sailboat in 1891 and became the founding president of Belcher Asphalt Paving Company, later named Belcher Oil Company. In 1926, they established a storage facility on Fisher Island in Biscayne Bay to service the cruise industry. And in 1932, they expanded to Port Everglades, West Palm Beach, Cape Canaveral, Fort Myers, Sarasota, and Tampa. Among the industries that were served by Belcher Oil were shipping, sugar manufacturing, space-age industries, the U.S. military, construction, dredging, paving, bridge building, pile driving, farming, food processing, hospitals, hotels, motels, restaurants, pest control, fertilizer, roofing, and trucking, not to mention the servicing of home. All those are actually advertised in the Miami Herald. There's a huge spread on Belcher Oil in the Miami Herald that said, these are all the things to buy, right? The entire economy of South Florida was dependent on Belcher Oil. The public gas company was founded on Northwest 2nd Avenue and 72nd Street in Miami in what is known as Little Lange in 1940. It was founded as a public utility by the former New Yorker Dan Ruskin. Since 1924, had been involved in home building in Bay County in conjunction with his brother-in-law, Max Orovitz. And the public gas company equipped new homes with the most satisfactory manner for cooking, refrigerating, water heating, and space heating. The company not only furnished individual tank and gas to homes, but to commercial establishments as well, right? And of course, to avoid discrimination, the company was given a non-Jewish name. By the way, the Radas were is Rudi Reisman and Annette Solomon. And she changed her name to Stevens, and he eventually shortened his name to Rada. Again, this was done in the 30s. We all know why. So, of course, all of this industry and construction came at the expense of South Florida's pristine landscapes, something that the Radas were deeply concerned about. The pristine beauty of Biscayne Bay was both one of the main reasons for visiting South Florida and the primary means by which industry could service the region, a contradiction that remains today, right? This picture here, this is our problem. As part of the Everglades series, the Radas documented this change, the change from the glade skips, which were the vernacular way of getting around on the left, to the new swamp buggies, which consumed oil and other fossil fuels. And so they were really trying to understand the not just the changes that were occurring in Miami, but also the changes to the Everglades as well. And of course to the people, because as part of the Everglades project, Annette produced a series of native Seminole Indians that resulted in a 1973 exhibition with a series of very powerful captions. This little girl, where's the little girl? Now, maybe it's not in this image, but you can see that the chickees and the outdoor living would give way to really modern industrial shed buildings and Christian religion and a whole series of things that effectively changed the way that the Seminoles lived on the land. and many didn't, particularly the older generation, the old medicine men, really wanted to have nothing to do with it. Whether fishing, sailing, watching the sunset, or observing the cloudscapes and landscapes of South Florida, the Radas understood that the ecological issues of balancing human activity and the specific environmental needs of the region were deeply concerning. And they knew intuitively that Miami, a sprawling and car-dependent city, was literally devouring several of its major tourist destinations. Again, a contradiction that remains today. Thank you so much. I'm more than happy to take questions or anything from... It's late, I realize. It's 5:30. If there are any questions or anything... Anybody? Oh, hi, yes, tell me your name.
Terry.
Hi, Terry.
Do the Radas have an archival, are there archival works collected in any one location? Or they...
So the question is about the Rada archives. 95% of it is at History Miami. And that's the book that I'm working on, which is in production, and the exhibition that I will be curating, that I am curating for 2025. Vizcaya has some 50 works that they produce, and there are a few private collections. Their personal letters are kept in Virginia Beach by the foundation of, I didn't mention her, the woman on the upper left, Margaret LaFranc, who was an artist based in Miami and in Taos, was a dear friend of Annette Rada. So she's got all the LaFranc Foundation in Hamptons in Virginia have all the private letters and documents.
So was that like the LaFranc of LaFranc City?
LaFranc. Margaret LaFranc.
And are they still alive?
No one's alive. Rudi died of a heart attack in 1961 while playing tennis. And Annette committed suicide in 1975. Yes.
Their children?
No children. They do have a goddaughter who lives in Chicago. Yes.
Hey.
Hi, Amy.
Question. I asked and I both remember the Morris Lapidus design of town into something in the Catskill. It's called the Concord. Now it's just like, you would put it in London. Wondering was whether the sides, the Concord and the Concourse, are there other Lapidus buildings that still exist?
Yeah, here in Miami. There may be some interiors in New York, because I mean he started off doing retail interiors in New York, but I'm not. I couldn't tell you what else is up there.
Maybe he started with retail.
Yeah, he started doing retail, which is why he was so funky, and then he moved that. Bye, Ed. Bye, Claudia. Thanks for coming. Yeah. Yes.
The pictures are very popular.
I'm sorry, whose pictures?
So the Radas photographs are very abundant and they're just building structures. What was their motivation for doing architectural work?
Well, my talk is about architectural photography. Their body of work covered everything. They did advertising for furniture. They did advertising. They worked for like horticultural magazines. She did mostly. So they did, all these kinds of garden magazines. They would do the covers because they would go to the botanical garden, the Fairchild, and they would photograph these things and they would put them on the covers and so they would do that. They would do advertising for building products like aluminum windows. They even did portraits of people, of well-known people. Neil Schiff, the Gardner Coles, who was the editor of Look magazine, whose wife, they had a house on Indian River. So they would they did a whole range of things. But I only showed you their architectural and landscapes really today. But it's again, I look forward to seeing everyone at the History Miami exhibit.
Yeah. Oh, what is that?
It opens May 2025.
Big news.
There was a question over there, I think? No?
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you all for coming.